Good morning, folks. Welcome back to the Philosophy for Philistines channel, where we're going to continue to plumb the impenetrable. Today's podcast ought to get me banned from every social media platform out there. But since I'm dedicated to telling the truth as best as I am able to tell it, let's forge ahead. What the Freedom Convoy is actually about. Our political class has been completely corrupted by lobbyists and special interest groups. I'll wager that our politicians have not served the interests of the constituents in their ridings for decades. Over time, they've grown bolder about admitting that they no longer serve us, to the point where they have now become enraged when we have the gall to complain about the fact that they're bought and paid for by outside interests. Over these past 2 years, Big Pharma is at the top of that list of mafioso. Until we return to free market individual economic liberty, without any central planning, while protecting the property rights and wealth of each citizen, we're screwed. As I see it, what the elite have done is to turn my country into a criminal organization, whoring itself out to the highest bidders at the taxpayer's expense. Why ideological possession undermines our conceptualization framework. So here we continue on with this theme. In yesterday's podcast, I stated that if there's one thing that exemplifies the nature of ideological possession, it is the inability to engage in self-reflection. By this I mean a lack of self-awareness as to the nature of how and why we perceive things as we do. Quite likely, when pressed to explain the reason for our beliefs, we will be unable to define them or explain why we adhere to them. As a result, we are unable to reflect upon our conceptualization framework in order to examine it. There is a second category, however. Those who are adherents of a political ideology into which they have been indoctrinated by their educators. This category will be able to recite verbatim their belief system by parroting what they have been taught, without ever having examined whether the tenets of their epistemology bring about its stated claims. They eschew measuring outcomes, since the actual outcome of their constant meddling invariably demonstrates their policies have the diametric opposite effects that were promised. Our leading politicians, cultural and intellectual elite, technocrats, and most of the ultra-wealthy fall into this category. To this latter category, self-reflection is impossible due to the fact they are utterly convinced of their superiority over the unwashed masses, people just like me. This is why Trudeau had stated clearly that people who oppose his oligarchical manner of governing hold unacceptable views. These attitudes apply in any circle where mere blind faith in an ideology has become a substitute for a deep and carefully considered epistemological and ontological framework that will enable us to parse out the world with humility. It is a humbling task to attempt to make sense of the multivariate, complex problems which modern life confronts us. We must always be careful to avoid assigning complex problems simplistic, one-size-fits-all solutions, which so often result in secondary, tertiary, and quaternary problems worse than the one-size-fits-all solution sought to address. Of course, this requires intelligence and the humility to understand the limitations of our own knowledge. Exercising caution is required, knowing that whatever policies we enact will have far-reaching consequences beyond that which was initially intended. As a prime example, a Johns Hopkins University study found the original COVID-19 lockdown in the spring of 2020 had little to no effect on mortality. The meta-analysis looked at interventions such as school and business closures, travel bans, and efforts to limit gatherings to determine if there is empirical evidence to support lockdowns. According to the study, lockdowns have had little to no effect on COVID-19 mortality, and in the US and Europe only reduced COVID-19 mortality by 0.2% on average. The link to that article is below. Why? I favor a minimal state, uncorrupted by lobbyists. The invisible hand theory is the concept that buyers and sellers in a free market knowingly act in a way benefiting the overall economy, as if guided by an invisible hand. The invisible hand was an expression used by the 18th century philosopher Adam Smith to describe the way that free market economies tend to correct themselves without any deliberate influence from outside forces. Smith said the buyers and sellers act out of self-interest, but inadvertently perform actions that result in a marketplace continuing to balance itself. He said it was as if buyers and sellers are guided by an invisible hand. Smith saw this market correction as a naturally occurring event. In contrast, he saw government intervention of the economy as unnatural, and he argued against it in most cases. Adam Smith's theory of free market individual economic liberty can be called a theory of absolute maximum economic advantage. If you ever want to be assured of the fact that our governments have sold out to special interest groups and lobbyists, please watch the following. Needle Points, featuring Dr. Norman Doidge on the Jordan B. Peterson podcast, Season 4, Episode 79. I provide the link here. In this podcast, Dr. Doidge goes into brutal and revealing detail how Big Pharma accessed our governance to exacerbate the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Doidge is not, I repeat, not an anti-vaxxer. He is well aware of the benefits of immunization, as well as reports accurately on past failures and risks. There have been multiple billions of dollars in punitive and criminal damages awarded by the courts in the past for the corruption, malfeasance, and lack of democratic oversight of the pharmaceutical industry. In Dr. Doidge's video on Dr. Jordan's program, he offers proof that the vast majority of big pharma budgets are spent on lobbying physicians and governments without providing proper scientific and statistical data to back up their claims. Even the regulatory agencies are run by and not kept at arm's length from the industry they are supposed to regulate. So, I ask my listeners, what is your conceptual framework? Do you want a government that answers to you, or do you want a government which is deep in bed with lobbyists who have corrupted the very meaning of representative democracy? Demand that your MPs and MPPs restore responsible government and rid this nation of the whoring on the hill that has perverted the very meaning of limited constitutional government for peace, order, and good government no longer exists. These are sad words. I hate speaking them, but nevertheless they are the truth, and they give us something to pray about. Have a great day, folks.